All right, welcome everyone. Happy 2022. My name is Emily Voss. I'm the Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier. And welcome to the January edition of Constitution 101. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who have joined us many times, an equal welcome to you. Our discussions for Constitution 101 are meant to be just that. They're meant to be very audience driven, very discussion friendly. So in just a moment, I'll introduce our speaker and he will leave a lot of time for your questions. So please feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature, whichever you feel more comfortable with, and post any questions as they occur to you. So if it's something that Dr. Breslin brings up in the first 10 minutes, go ahead and drop that question in right away. And then we'll answer your questions when he reaches that point in his talk. All right, so without further ado, I will very happily introduce our author this evening. Beau Breslin is the Joseph C. Palamountain Jr. Chair in Government and the former Dean of the Faculty, Vice President for Academic Affairs at Skidmore College up in Saratoga Springs, New York. He holds a PhD in Constitutional Thought from the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of the Communitarian Constitution, From Words to Worlds, Exploring Constitutional Functionality, which was part of the John Hopkins series in Constitutional Thought, and his latest work, which is why he's here this evening, A Constitution for the Living, Imagining How 5 Generations of Americans Would Rewrite the Nation's Fundamental Law, which came out last year. In addition to writing about constitutional issues, he has also published works on capital punishment, restorative justice, and legal philosophy. So I am very excited to hear from Dr. Breslin this evening. This is such an interesting topic. I feel like oftentimes we've had scholars come on Constitution 101 and look at kind of every angle of the Constitution as it exists. But I think your book is just so interesting of a thought experiment. And I'll let you take it from here and explain how you've kind of thought through this process of the idea of a constitution for the living.
Thanks so much, Emily. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and all the listeners and viewers. I want to thank the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier. It's kind of coming home for me. I was there at the beginning of the birth of the center, and it's really nice to get back. Thank you to all the viewers, and happy Martin Luther King Day to everyone out there. As Emily mentioned, my book is different, and I want to start by I'll describe how it's different in a second, but I want to start by saying what I set out to do was contribute to a conversation that has picked up steam as of late, and that is the conversation about whether or not it's time to return to Philadelphia and rewrite the Constitution. And what I'm going to do, hopefully we'll get through this quickly without being irresponsible. I have about 8 slides that I want to show you, and the idea is to describe what the book is about, and then go through each of the slides, and then provide as much time as possible for the folks in the audience to ask questions or comment. People generally tend to like to talk about what constitutional reform should look like, so I want to eagerly get to that. And I'm going to share my screen with you, assuming this all works, because as I said, I have a couple of slides I want to do. All right, let's start by doing slideshow. Start. Okay, so let me describe for you what the book is about. Emily mentioned it's called A Constitution for the Living, and it takes a simple debate between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and kind of imagines a different world, right? So, I'm a constitutional theorist. I'm very interested in constitutions, and as most of you know, Madison in 1787, father of the Constitution, is writing the Constitution. He has great admiration for Jefferson. So when he's done with the project in September of 1787, he ships off a copy of the Constitution to Jefferson, who's in Paris. and asks Jefferson what he thinks about the Constitution. And they get into this roughly 2-year correspondence back and forth about the virtues and vices of the draft Constitution. And Jefferson writes back to Madison and says, oh, I like certain things about the Constitution, but one thing I do not like about the Constitution is that there's no sunset clause, right? So what he meant by that is there's no mechanism for the Constitution to be rewritten at various times. And he writes this famous line, he writes this famous statement that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it. And Jefferson writes this essentially to say that a constitution created by one generation that is authoritative over a future generation is just another form of tyranny. For him, that was really problematic. And so he and Madison are back and forth about generational constitutional change. Jefferson, being the amateur mathematician, does all this calculation and decides that every 19 years, that's when a generation turns over. And so every 19 years, the Constitution ought to be rewritten. Madison writes him back and says, oh, no, that's not, that doesn't work. Constitutions must endure over long periods of time in order to have the necessary strength and stability and credibility, so that the country that the Constitution is constituting is stable. So they, throughout their lives, they disagreed. Jefferson forever, for his entire period of his life, thought that each generation ought to write its own constitution. Madison was a fan of enduring constitutions. So what my book is, it's a simple counterfactual. What would those constitutions have looked like if Jefferson had convinced Madison and others that generational constitutional change was good? What would the constitutions in American history have looked like if Jefferson had won that debate? And so what I did was I imagined in narrative form 5 constitutional conventions, and I write the stories of those constitutional conventions and the constitutions that are drafted during that period. Now, a couple of ground rules before I get to the constitutional conventions. First of all, Jefferson argued that each constitutional convention ought to occur every 19 years because for him, that's the kind of the changeover moment for a new generation. That was a little indulgent for me to do to imagine a constitutional convention every 19 years. There wouldn't have been that much change, and it just seemed that was a little bit too much. So what I did is I took the spirit of Jefferson's generational constitutional idea and I identified the life expectancy of those people at the time of the Constitution and situated constitutional conventions based on life expectancy. So you'll see that I have 5 constitutional conventions that come after 1787. One's in 1825, one's in 1863, one's in 1903, 1953, and 2022. And those are based on the life expectancy of the average person at the time. So in 1787, the average life expectancy of a white male was 38 years. So I imagined a constitutional convention 38 years from 1787 and 1825. Life expectancy does not change in 1825. It's still 38 years. So fast forward 38 more years, and what you have is 1863. Life expectancy is a little bit longer. In 1863, it's 40 years. So the next constitutional convention was 1903. Then 50 years, 1953. And in 1953, the average life expectancy of the American citizen was 69 years, which means that the Constitutional Convention would have been 2022 this year. Super exciting that it aligns nicely with this year. What is my data? I can't make things up. It wouldn't have been a credible experiment if I had made things up. So I use state constitutional conventions, state constitutions. There's 155 different state constitutional conventions in our history. They provide a wealth of insight into what constitutional convention conversations would have looked like at various times in American history. Sure, they're at the state level, and nationalizing them would have been a little different. But state constitutions and state constitutional conventions talk about the same things that federal constitutional conventions would have talked about: power, rights, liberties, equality, things like that, values, and so on. So I took that as part of the data. Constitutional amendments, Supreme Court cases, these were all part of the story that I crafted for each individual convention. And as I write in the bottom here, my conventions, the various chapters are in narrative form. They're storytelling. I talk about people who were alive at the time and would have been invited to the Constitutional Convention, what they stood for, and so on. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first Constitutional Convention is 1825. And Daniel Webster is the gentleman at the right side of the screen. There's no question in my mind that Daniel Webster would have been a major player, would have been a delegate from Massachusetts. He was the foremost lawyer in the country at the time, and he absolutely would have been part of a constitutional convention. I make it clear in my writing that every constitutional convention will be in Philadelphia as a nod to the original 1787 framers. And what they would have talked about in 1823 are various things, right? Including electoral college reform. Why? Because the 1824 presidential election, the one that gave us John Quincy Adams as our president, was a bit of a disaster, right? It was the second presidential election that was thrown into the House of Representatives. The 12th Amendment worked sort of, but not completely. And so the Electoral College would have come under scrutiny in 1825. And if you combine sort of the thinking that the Electoral College would have been tinkered with a little bit, I'm not suggesting that they would have gotten rid of it. They would not have in 1825, but they would have tinkered with it, in part because of the populism of the kind of Jacksonian era that we were entering. I make an argument that the Electoral College would have looked a lot different after 1825. You would have eliminated the state legislature from selecting delegates, and it would have been a much more democratized Electoral College. I also argue that most state constitutions at the time front-loaded their Declaration of Rights. We could spend the entire hour talking about Hamilton and Madison's argument that Bill of Rights was not necessary, but it was added to the 1787 Constitution. In 1825, they would have put likely Article 1 Declaration of Rights first, after the preamble, before the design of Congress. So it would have gone preamble, Article 1, list of rights, including some that were not in the Bill of Rights, and then Article 2 would have been Congress. I argue in 1825 that there would have been a change to federal court appointments. Enough people were pissed off at John Marshall at the time that they would have probably tried to do a lot of delegates to the 1825 Constitutional Convention would have wanted to change the federal court appointment structure from lifetime tenure to something like, I make an argument that the House of Representatives would have suggested that the House of Representatives nominate federal court judges confirmed by the Senate for a 7-year probationary period. After 7 years, you do get lifetime tenure, but there's kind of this 7-year probationary period, which was very common at the state level. And then finally, in 1825, among other things, I think they would have changed our wonderful preamble, right? The preamble says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States." If we live in a Jeffersonian world where we're doing generational constitutions, there is no need for establishing a constitution for our posterity, for those in the future. So as a result, the preamble likely would have changed in 1825. Maybe the most interesting constitutional convention would have happened in 1863, 38 years after because that's the life expectancy of the average American. Note the year, right? 1863, we're smack dab right in the middle of the Civil War. I probably would have preferred that the Constitutional Convention not appear in the middle of the Civil War, but it was super fun to craft a narrative, a story about this Constitutional Convention. And I'll talk for a moment about some of the questions that would have arisen in 1863. So first of all, where to hold the Constitutional Convention. As I said, I sort of make this argument in kind of the historical narrative that we'll always go back to Philadelphia as a nod to the original framers. Well, in Philadelphia in 1863, and I also make the claim that the conventions would have started at roughly the same time, so mid-May of the year, right? So in 1863, Robert E. Lee's army is not that far away from Philly. So the question is, do you hold the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia? And what I did is super interesting. I reached out to a great Civil War historian who's now at Princeton, a guy named Alan Guelzo. Everybody should read his book about Gettysburg. He was, when I reached out to him, he was at the time at Gettysburg College, but now he's at Princeton. And I said, Alan, here's my scenario. Where might they have held the Constitutional Convention in 1863, assuming it went on? And I said, would it be New York or Boston or something like that? And he wrote me back and he said, Beau, they probably would have considered, the framers probably in 1863 probably would have considered Columbus, Ohio. And I said, Columbus, Ohio, really? And he said, yeah, don't forget a couple things. One is they want to give a nod to those Western states west of the Appalachian. Two, Ohio is the third largest state by population. They probably would have given some thought to Columbus, Ohio. But ultimately, he said, certainly not New York. New York was very much kind of in bed with the secessionists, more so than any other city in the North. So probably they would have gone to Boston. Here we are in Boston in 1863. And the gentlemen that you see on the right are James Ashley and John Bingham, the two famous figures who ultimately crafted the 14th Amendment. They certainly would have been at the 1863 Constitutional Convention. The topics of conversation would have been those that were part of the equation at the time of the Civil War. Slavery would have been a dominant topic of conversation. What I write is this ongoing discussion about emancipation and equal protection. What would a constitutional clause have looked like in 1863 if they had an opportunity to sit around the Boston State House and craft together a new constitutional convention? Now, no Southern states would have sent any delegates, so it would have been Northerners. It would have been much a debate between kind of the moderate Republicans, the Lincoln wing, and the radical Republicans. It would have been a really interesting debate. They would have certainly would have talked about Black suffrage, and they certainly would have talked about apportionment, right? When they eliminate the 3/5 compromise, they would have, the framers would have thought, okay, how do we figure out how to apportion with the eye towards eventually the Union coming together? Most would have thought eventually the Union would have come together again. How do we think about apportionment when we have the emancipated enslaved peoples? Those were the major topics of conversation. Obviously, there were lots of other topics of conversation that were part of the 1863 Constitution, but a super interesting conversation, and imagining a constitution in 1863 was daunting and exciting. 1903, we're back to Philadelphia, right? So it's now 40 years later, and the life expectancy, as I said, of Americans in 1863 was 40 years. The 1903 Constitution, also extremely interesting. First constitutional convention to welcome people of color, right? Booker T. Washington in the middle could possibly, maybe even likely would have been invited to the Constitutional Convention from the state of Alabama, right? He's in Alabama. And Alabama was going through a progressive period at the time, not racially progressive, but they would have been going through a progressive period they went through a progressive period at the time. And interestingly, as Booker T. Washington, as a bit of an assimilationist, probably would have been a serious consideration for Alabama to send as a delegate, because it was unlikely that he was going to be, Frederick Douglass or somebody who was a little bit more antagonistic. So Booker T. Washington gets the invitation in my story. On the right is Quanah Parker, who's, for all intents and purposes, one of the major figures in the Comanche tribe. He too was a major figure at the turn of the 20th century. He might have been, he likely would have been invited. The guy on the left is a Congress member from Tennessee, who I'll talk about in a second, a guy named Thetis Sims, Congress member from Tennessee. So what would they have talked about in 1903? Well, they're going to talk about a lot of things, right? They're going to talk about monopolies. They're going to talk about the economic collapse of the 1890s. But one of the interesting things they would have, a constitutional convention in 1903 would have talked about, is the vote for women. Why? Because it's not for almost 20 more years that the amendment comes in traditional and historical times, but the franchise for women was a fairly significant conversation for the previous 20 years before the turn of the, or more, before the turn of the 20th century. So they absolutely would have given conversation to it. And this is where Thetis Sims comes in, because there's this little known sort of true historical moment or movement, I will, called the Southern Strategy, right? So there were some white men from the South who got together with those who wanted to, mostly men, who wanted to extend the franchise to women. And those folks thought that one of the strategies that they could use to convince states in the South to extend the right to vote to women was to, the argument was it would dilute the Black vote, right? So you bring what amounts to 25 million additional women onto the voter rolls, most of whom are white. They're likely to, quote, follow their husbands in voting for particular candidates. And what it does is if you add that many white women, the thinking went, the Southern Strategy went, you'd dilute the Black vote. I argue that Thetis Sims, who's a real figure, a real Congress member, kind of takes that to the convention, and there's this moment where his ulterior motive is uncovered by a newspaper man, and he has to resign from his position. But ultimately, the franchise for women gets passed. They probably would have also, lots of state constitutions at the time had this introductory statement that kind of resembled the Declaration of resembled the Declaration of Independence. That the famous phrase about protection of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, you'll see in lots of state constitutions. So I have Booker T. Washington kind of advocating for that super interesting moment. I have Quanah Parker, as I said, advocating for Native American land rights. This is the time when Teddy Roosevelt and others were essentially trying to eliminate or dilute the power of indigenous peoples and make them more, kind of like the white European, like give them, 40 acres or 30 acres or 20 acres and make them all kind of capitalist private property. Quanah Parker, I have going to the Constitutional Convention and ultimately trying to argue against that, but he ends up losing that battle. 1903, super interesting Constitutional Convention. 1953, 50 years later, the next Constitutional Convention comes. And what you have, the folks that you see is Thurgood Marshall up on top, 1953, right? We're right at the heart of Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall certainly would have been invited to represent New York, right? Because he's coming out of the NAACP, he's coming out of New York City. He's born in Baltimore, but the state in which he resides in 1953 is New York. So he's a delegate from New York. You have Percival Baxter, who's the former governor of the state of Maine, with his dog Gary on the left. He is arguably the most famous Mainer at the time, although he hasn't been governor for quite some time. He would have been no doubt invited. You have Mary McLeod Bethune, vice president of the NAACP, on FDR's Black Cabinet. She likely would have been there. This 1953 Constitutional Convention is the first to welcome women, right? It was unlikely that women would have been invited to 1903. So in 1953, they get invited to, and they come well represented in my story. Some of the arguments that they would have, you can imagine, I have this interesting story about Thurgood Marshall being frustrated with the Equal Protection Clause not being, because of course, this is the convention would have met before he argues for the second time, right? Remember 1952, and then he argues Brown versus Board of Education, and then the Supreme Court asks him to re-argue in 1953, but not till December. The 1953 Constitutional Convention starts in May. I have him frustrated that the Equal Protection Clause is not holding its weight. What are we going to do about that? One of the interesting debates would have been term limits for president in 1953. Imagine, yes, it becomes an amendment to our 1787 Constitution, but if you have now periodic constitutional conventions, timing is interesting, right? So FDR wins his fourth term in 1944, right? He dies 82 days into his presidency. So the question becomes, do you wait until 1953 to have the conversation about term limits, knowing that you'll not get an FDR, somebody who could stand for 3 or 4 terms, until after the 1953 Constitution? So it's an interesting question about timing. And then I have this fascinating conversation about ratification, right? Ratification is one of my joys. I love talking about ratification. And when you think about the 1787 Constitution, the Article 7 is simple. It says this: the ratification of the convention of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution, and here's the important part, between the states so ratifying the same, right? So if you think about periodic constitutional conventions, how do you resolve that issue? And what I argue is in 1825, 1863, 1903, in those, I argue that the convention delegates would not have asked for unanimous ratification. But in 1953, they were ready for unanimous ratification. And it's interesting to me when you think about ratification. Sure, in 1787, all 13 states end up ratifying. But what if one had held out, right? So, or what if in 1825, 5 states had held out? What would have happened? One of the interesting things is when it comes to constitutional amendments, it requires eventually 3/4 of the states to ratify a constitutional amendment. What do we do about the 25% who either don't vote for ratification or don't ratify? We just say to those 25% of the states, those 1/4 of the states, too bad, you're living by the constitutional amendments. So for me, there has to be a moment, if you imagine periodic constitutional conventions, where they're going to require unanimous ratification. And I argue that in 1953 is that year. Which brings us to 2022, right? Most people who I talk to about my book project like to talk about 2022, right? So 69 years after 1953, we're now ready to talk about, we're ready to have another constitutional convention. It's coincidental that the book was published in 2021, but I'm super excited about this year as the quote unquote convention year. We're back in Philadelphia. And here's some things that that most of you will know all about. Some of the things that people have talked about in the New York Times or in the Atlantic or with the National Constitution Center, or certainly at the Robert Smith Center for the Constitution, thinking about what a new constitution would look like. First of all, who's going to be involved, right? Who's going to be part of the conversation about constitutional conventions? One of the interesting things that happened in our lifetime is that Iceland tried to crowdsource its constitution around 2010, and it had a kind of a fascinating experiment in public contributions to constitutional conventions. Countries like South Africa did not do that, but would crowdsourcing be part of the conversation? That's super interesting. I make an argument in there that there are various ways to get the public involved. One of the things that I make an argument is from Larry Sabato out of the University of Virginia, who thinks if you hold a constitutional convention today, it's going to have to be regular citizens that are participants, not the traditional lawyers, judges, and politicians who are generally the ones who write constitutions. So how do we get enough people? What's the role of interest groups? It'd be a fascinating conversation. And before I talk about some of the structural design changes that I talk about in 2022, let me tell you one thing that was a challenge to my 2020, imagining a 2022 constitutional convention. It was this challenge. I had in 1825, 1863, 1903, and 1953, I could use historical figures, long since dead, as long as I made the argument that they would have argued particular things at their various conventions. I could use everybody from Daniel Webster to Booker T. Washington. I have Gerald Ford, of all people, being the president of the 1953 Constitution and that the Constitutional Convention, and that kind of catapults him to be eventually president of the United States, right? But in 2022, I can't use historical figures. I have to use real figures. So one of the challenges I faced was I had to get on the horn, get on the phone with folks who I thought might be invited to the Constitutional Convention and ask them to participate as a delegate, right? Which was super interesting. So the two gentlemen that you see here on the top is Douglas Banks, right? He's a Baptist minister from Philadelphia. And I created the narrative in which he is the presiding officer. He's the president. He's the George Washington of the Constitutional Convention. And what made him the George Washington or the president is that he's the 5th generation descendant of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. And I thought that was totally fitting. So I called him up and I said, Doug, do you mind? Never talked to him before. Would you like to participate in my imaginary Constitutional Convention? And being the generous, beautiful human being that he is, he was totally psyched to do it. So he's my presiding officer. Mike Bruni is the guy on the bottom. He is the CEO and president of the Sierra Club, the world's largest environmental conservation group. So I called him up because there's no doubt in my mind that environmental issues would be on the docket at a 2022 Constitutional Convention. And I said, Mike, would you mind being a participant in my imaginary Constitutional Convention? He too, beautiful person, says absolutely. And he and I, he crafted language like he was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. It was super fun, as I said. So you see in my second bullet point, environmental protection. Obviously, there are so many things that I talk about in the book that you all want to no doubt get in and talk about. Senate reconfiguration. No more undemocratic institution in the United States than the Senate, where California has 80 times the population of Wyoming, 40 million versus 500, roughly 500,000, and yet each get 2 senators. So I have the delegates thinking about ways in which we can make the Senate different. I have delegates thinking about the impeachment and the recall process. and issues of abortion and same-sex marriage and gun control and different ways in which you can change the amendment process, because the hill is too high to climb these days with amending the Constitution. So all of those things are in my 2022 chapter, and I'm eager to hear from you about what your ideas are and those sorts of things. And I'm happy to talk to you about the ideas that came out of conversations I had with these and other folks like Sandy Levinson and others who helped me to think about what would be in a 2022 convention. And I'll finish my presentation by talking just for a second about the preamble. There is no question in my mind that if you sat down with hundreds of delegates to a constitutional convention back in Philadelphia in 2022, our preamble would look different. The new drafted preamble would look different. And what I do, and one of the things that a lot of countries have done in their preambles, is kind of give a nod to their horrible past, right? So I crafted a preamble, and I'm going to show it to you as a way to finish up. It looks like this. This is what I would argue would be, could be a constitutional preamble in a 2022 constitutional convention. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and acknowledge a history of injustice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, remedy the wounds of systemic prejudice, other institutional forms of discrimination, slavery's persistent legacy, and the destruction of indigenous nations and native peoples, promote the general welfare, endeavor to achieve greater equity, and secure the blessings of liberty to all, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Everybody probably could craft a different constitutional preamble. That's the one I write in the book, but I'm eager to hear what you have to say about that too. Finally, I'll finish by saying the book was a labor of love. There is nothing greater I can imagine in my own professional life than to imagine what constitutional conventions would have looked like throughout American history if Jefferson had been able to persuade Madison and others about generational constitutions. But I also recognize that if you have 100 people in the room doing this experiment in speculative history or counterfactual history, you're going to get 100 different constitutions. Everybody has a different idea about what their constitution would look like. I hope mine is at least credible. The ones I describe are at least credible. But as I said before, everybody's going to have a different one. And on that note, I'm eager to hear what yours look like. And I'll stop the screen sharing.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And I've already got a few great questions queued up, but folks, please feel free to keep those questions coming. So I think there's kind of a first series of questions that are almost nuts and bolts. So, thinking through the historic conventions that you talked us through, who would have chosen the delegates, for one? And would these conventions have been called expressly to amend the existing Constitution, or is there any concern that any one of these conventions could have taken a leaf from Madison and his friends and scrapped it and started over? So those are a couple of questions there. And then I also have a question with regards to ratification.
Yeah.
So how do you think each of these constitutions would have been ratified in their given years? So that's a lot of questions at once, but
yeah. So I'm writing them down so I don't forget. Okay, and ratification. Fantastic questions, good nuts and bolts questions. And I do write about this a little bit in the book in order to kind of situate it. So before 2022, if you imagine Jefferson's periodic constitutions happening in 1825, 1863, 1903, 1953, it is likely that state legislators would have still picked their delegates, right, in those four. No chance. I think there's no chance that state legislators would be given the power to do so today in 2022. But up until 1953, I think it's pretty clear that state legislatures would have been as good as any other body to pick the delegates. I also make the argument that, how are you going to figure out how many people, like how many delegates come from each state? And I have little formulas in my book that say, here's how it would have worked. Most of the time, certainly 55 delegates would not have worked even as close to 1825 because there's lots of states added. So it creeps up a little bit to eventually be in the kind of mid 200s. And then by 2022, I argue that there's a reason why there's 513, and you can figure that out by looking at the book. So, but state legislatures up until 1953 likely would have been. In terms of fascinating question, in terms of sort of pulling a Madison and scrapping the Constitution and starting over again. So Jefferson, I take a little bit of liberty with Jefferson. It's fairly clear that Jefferson thought that coming together just to amend the Constitution was good enough, right? But that's not so much fun, right? So ultimately, I kind of take what Jefferson said and imagine real constitutional conventions where they could, in fact, start over again. I do make the argument, though, that until 2022, there wouldn't have been hugely radical design changes because things were working relatively okay in terms of bicameral legislatures and presidents and so on. Yes, I make arguments that you might have one-term presidents that are 6 or 8 years, but ultimately, structurally, separation of powers and federalism probably wouldn't have been tinkered with in the radical sense. But you have in 1903, I make an argument that Henry Cabot Lodge, for example, would have wanted real significant power shifting to the president in foreign affairs, right? So what does that look like? That's a real structural change. And I have a couple more of that. 2022, I think the Senate either goes away, right, or is so radically different. I think there's term limits for Congress members. I think there's term limits for federal court of justices. So it would be a radical change in 2022, but maybe not up until 1953. And ratification, I love conventions. So up until 2022, I would have thought that they would have done state ratification conventions. In 2022, I make the argument that it would probably be a double supermajority, right? 60% of the populace in a referendum votes up, as long as it's 60%, that 60% represents 60% of the voting age population. So, but certainly it would have been some supermajority. And if you have a constitutional convention now, ratification would be a popular ratification.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. All right, so there's so many good questions. I promise we are going to get to as many of these as possible.
Oh, I can stay for as long as you want, Emily.
Excellent. All right, so question, would the conventions be open? Because of course, one of the key pieces of the 1787 convention is that it's held in secret. So is that something that you think would have continued, or is that something that eventually the public would no longer have tolerated?
Yeah, so another fascinating conversation. So another fascinating question. I make the argument that 1825, you can make a credible case that it would have been held in secret. I'm not saying, I mean, one of the beauties, one of the virtues, one of the exciting things about the 1787 Constitutional Convention is not only did they agree to keep it in secret, but for the most part, it was kept in secret, right? There wasn't a lot of leakage. You don't see a lot of newspaper folks are, arguing or claiming that there were leaks. 1825, you might have gotten away with it, but I also make the argument that there were leaks in 1825. By 1863, I make the argument that you just can't hold the dam back, right? And ultimately, that they agreed. There were people who were very serious in 1863 about accountability in government, And I make the argument that they decide not to hold it in secret in 1863, and ultimately that leads to some other interesting challenges. But I think in 1825 you probably could keep keep it secret. Probably not after that.
Excellent. Okay. So another, you all are asking such thoughtful questions, so thank you, and certainly keep them coming. So question from James: Jefferson's 1789 letter with the idea of generational constitutions was mainly motivated by the idea of not leaving the following generation with debt. So each generation would settle prior to disappearing. Does the idea appear in any of your hypothetical conventions? So the settling of
I think the answer is no, right? Because that's super sophisticated, understanding of Jefferson's 1789 letter. I was keeping a little bit more what I would describe as user-friendly. That said, there's no question in my mind that in the modern era, there would be conversation about fiscal responsibility in a constitutional convention, right? Maybe not in 1953, but imagine in at the end of the 20th century, when you had all these balanced budget amendments and so on. I think it would be hard not to have a constitutional convention in 2022 and have a major topic of discussion be fiscal responsibility broadly understood. And at that point, I would imagine that Jefferson's argument in 1789 would have come to light. But no, I don't talk about that, partly because I like the other stuff a little bit more, but it is part of Jefferson's argument. And I should mention, Emily, before you ask another question, one of the good things, one of the vices, the virtues and vices of the book is that I had to make some choices, right? Can you imagine how detailed it would be if I did 5 conventions? So I had to make some choices about what to cover and what not to cover. As I said, 100 people in the room, it's going to be 100 different constitutional stories.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to kind of combine 2 questions here because they both relate to the same topic, which is the Senate. So in your proposal, the Senate eventually goes away because of its sort of nature as an undemocratic body. But one of the participants has pointed out, rightly so, that one of the reasons that the Senate exists as we know it is in the interest of states to have something resembling equal power in one of the branches of government. So what would be the compelling reason for the states to decide that that's no longer something they're interested in? So kind of those 2 questions I pulled together. I hope that's okay with the askers.
Yeah, so fair enough. And let me just clarify. I have one of the interesting things about doing this work in this moment is you see lots of ideas. And in my book, in the 2022 Constitutional Convention, I make an argument. This comes from a conversation I had with Sandy Levinson, who is a delegate. He's a law professor at the University of Texas. He argues he's just fed up with the Senate, right? So he is a participant. He does not suggest that we get rid of the Senate. So when I said eliminating the Senate, that's a very radical idea that ultimately I do not add to the book. I cannot imagine that that's going to happen, right? What is interesting is some of the other options, which I do talk about in the book, that are more likely to happen. So 2 in particular, and I asked them as a question, right? Can you imagine the Senate power being reduced significantly because, and this is what Sandy proposes, because of the undemocratic nature of the Senate, so that the Senate is responsible for things like confirming nominees and so on, but not lawmaking. You strengthen the House of Representatives as the real democratic institution to make lawmaking. And you have, this is what Sandy proposed in my book, you have a National Assembly, an additional third branch of the legislature that looks. Larry Sabato said that you ought to have these kind of super senators who are former members of the House. I mean, former presidents, former vice presidents, former justices of the Supreme Court, and so on. Have them as part of this National Assembly or the Senate. So the other argument that gets a lot of traction is the argument where no, you don't base Senate representation entirely on population, but you give some of the states in the Senate a few more senators based on their population. So maybe California gets 5 and Wyoming gets 1, but ultimately the Senate is still around. So make no mistake, I do not think the Senate is going anywhere. Secondly, I'll say this. When I had the conversation with delegates in 2022, one of which was Sandy, and he's arguing that thing, the one thing that I did, in addition to crafting what these delegates were telling me, Mike Bruni in Environment, Sandy Levinson Senate, and so on, is I get to make the claim as to whether they pass the Constitutional Convention. And Sandy's radical idea of a third legislative branch, I say in the book, just too radical, doesn't pass, and we're ending up with the bicameral legislature we currently have. I generally think Constitutional Convention delegates are conservative with the small c, as in maintaining the status quo generally. So I make the argument that the Senate sticks around, even though it's still undemocratic.
All right. So perhaps along those lines, how do you see the political parties being major players really in any of the conventions, but certainly the one in 2022, because as we know, 1787 convention party is not really on the table, but certainly has become a huge factor in how we understand constitutional government.
Yeah, so there's just literally, Emily, no way you can avoid having partisan influence in any constitutional convention, basically after 1800. So I think parties would have been, major player throughout. And I write a little bit about that in various constitutional conventions. What's interesting to me is to think about our divided, what I would describe as sort of partisan tribalism of 2022 right now. What that would look like. And do I think that a constitutional convention would have been a little bit more seamless and less controversial in, say, the Obama years? Yeah, I do, than they are currently. And I'm not suggesting that in the Trump years or in the Biden years, and I'm not picking a partisan side. It's just we're in a different environment now. I'm 55. I might look younger than I'm 55, but I'm 55, and I've never seen the country as divided as it's been now. And I get, I was born in '66, so Vietnam and so on might have been as divided. But ultimately, from a political scientist perspective, I think a convention now would be hard, and I think the parties would contribute to dysfunctional. That's why I think one of the things that's interesting is Larry Sabato's argument that if you're going to have a constitutional convention today, you need just regular everyday citizens, not politicians. How we get there is a totally different ballgame. But if you get everyday citizens, you stand a chance of having some consensus in a way that politicians, I don't think, bring to the table.
Okay, I'm gonna also, there's 2 questions pertaining to the 1863 convention. One of them is a short one, which is from a participant who I know is a teacher. She is looking for ideas for her students' project-based assessments, and she is asking if she would be able to use your ideas for an 1863 convention. So any other teachers out there, you get the thumbs up.
Absolutely, use whatever you want.
All right, and then also an 1863
compliment to me.
It would be a great experiment for any civics or government classroom, absolutely. Question in any of the conventions, did anyone ever propose the incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the states? The 1863 convention run by John Bingham would probably have been interested in that.
Yeah, so I think so. So the answer is, and when I teach my students in civil liberties, that's my favorite topic of conversation is the incorporation, right? So what I do in there, it's a great question, but what I do in various conventions is I think about what the conversations would have been regarding state involvement in clause drafting, right? So to what extent would our current 14th Amendment have incorporated the Bill of Rights, or how would we have changed the drafting of the First Amendment, our current First Amendment, to make it apply to the states too? It's a fascinating question. I think between me and you and the viewers, yes, they would have been pretty clear post in 1863 or post 1863 to include states in any language changes in the Bill of Rights. So I think the incorporation would have happened naturally over the course post 1863 over the course of various conventions.
All right. So there's a couple of really thoughtful points, and they're not so much worded as questions, but I think maybe if you would like to respond to the comments, that would be just fine. Okay, so Madison had the foresight to realize that stability was paramount. The idea of rewriting the Constitution is something similar to changing the rules of the game in the middle of the game. And there's already, two ways of amending the Constitution baked into Article 5. Right. So, I wonder if you could kind of speak to that function in place, but you're proposing something radically different. So
yeah, so you went out a little bit there, and I'll hopefully I'll get the gist of your statement. Yeah, so one of the things that's super interesting about this experiment is you're absolutely right. The individual who said the statement is absolutely right. Changing the rules of the game. Constitutions are rules, right? And changing the rule of the game halfway through the game or in the mid part of the game. I would think that Jefferson would say to you, that assumes that the rules of the game hasn't ended when a generation changes over, right? So if we live in a Jeffersonian world, we live in a world in which there are periodic games. And it's hard to imagine in the United States. But if you think about outside the US, the average life expectancy of a constitution around the world is 15 years, right? So it happens to be that ours is 230 now, going on 235 years, 234 plus. But 15 years is the normal life expectancy of a constitution. And so we're the outlier. And I think ultimately Jefferson just believed that tyranny could come in many forms, including one generation being beholden to another. Now, I should mention here, partly because of the fact that we're at Montpelier, I'm totally a Madisonian, right? I do not think Jefferson was right. I do not think that we should have embraced a Jeffersonian notion of generational constitution. Madison was totally right about enduring constitutions being stable, for being the key to stability and legitimacy and so on. So don't think just because of the fact that I'm kind of imagining a Jeffersonian world that I'd like to live in one.
You're not obligated to say that just because you're chatting with James Madison.
Go Madison.
All right. Well, I think what I'd like to do, I'm going to pose this question to you, but I'm also going to pose this as a question to the participants. So we'll get a response here as our last activity. All right. So the question on the table is, how would the conventions get public input, and how much sway would that ultimately have? And I think what I'd like to ask the participants to do, as Dr. Breslin is considering the question, is if we were to host a convention in 2022, I would love to know, what issues would you want to see as part of that convention. So feel free to drop that into the chat. And I think it would just be really, really interesting to see, the 38 of us, what all our concerns are in 2022. But Dr. Breslin, how would those conventions get their public input?
Okay, so lots of different ways, right? So I imagine I write in the beginning of the 2022 chapter about the different avenues for public input. You could imagine, for example, Emily, to do it in kind of a traditional crowdsourcing way, as in Wikipedia page that where people literally get on and change the Constitution, and it's an evolution, it's a work in progress. I'll ultimately argue that that would not work for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is it's not inclusive, right? Those who don't have the leisure time to spend or the technical ability to be able to go on and change the Wikipedia Constitution would not participate, and we want participants. You could also imagine, I write in the piece, in the chapter, you could also imagine an app, right? Google came out with an app called Constitute. Check it out, look it up. It's super interesting. It's meant, the Google app, literally the Google app Constitute, is meant to compare constitutions around the world. But you could just as easily have an app where people kind of in a game sort of format participate as framers, and all that data gets downloaded to the convention delegates. There's a guy that wrote this fascinating book before COVID on constitutional cafes, where he went around the country and he held, like informal cafes, informal coffees with people, and asked them what they would change about the Constitution. You could do that, and in a COVID environment, it would be a little bit different. You could have caucuses. I make an argument that the traditional caucus sense, where individual parties get to, people with similar interests, partisan parties get together and craft ideas, might work really well, because you as a kind of preliminary. Ultimately, though, I'll say this: constitutional conventions tend to gravitate to the traditionalist, right? We tend to like constitutional conventions around the world, either at the state level or around the world, where people meet, delegates are assigned, they're actually in a room together, they craft it together. The question for all of us, and I'll end on this note, the question for all of us is, who would be invited? That's the ultimate question, assuming a kind of a traditional constitutional convention, which we could hold at Montpelier if we had 200 or 300 people. That would be super fun and a very appropriate place to have a 2022 constitutional convention.
That would be pretty amazing, that's for sure.
Would.
All right, well, and I would love to shout out some of these really excellent inputs from our participants. So in our 2022 convention at Montpelier, why not? Some items on the table for discussion. We have a lot of interest in term limits for the Supreme Court justices. At least 3 people listed that. Yeah. The extension of the social safety net. Yep. We have elimination of the Electoral College. Yep. Public financing of political campaigns. Gerrymandering is a concern. Balanced federal budget. And true equality of gender, pay, medical care, and humane treatment. So there's a lot of really fascinating ideas. Oh, and also a revisiting of the First Amendment and more clarity and separation of church and state. So many good ideas. So, I think if we were actually at Montpelier, certainly for a convention, we would have to be there for some time in order to address all these concerns. But participants, thank you so much for your really thoughtful questions this evening. I'm sorry we didn't get to every single one of them, but I would certainly encourage you to pick up Dr. Breslin's book and read in further detail about these different conventions. And if you are looking for a great dinner discussion, certainly put forward to your friends, your family, hey, if we were to hold a convention in 2022, what do you think? Just seems like a great way to kick things off. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Dr. Breslin, for your time this evening.
Thanks, Emily.
You're welcome. And Constitution 101 will be back February 20th, at which point we will be digging into the relationship of John Marshall and James Madison. So we're going to throw it back a little bit to a historic discussion, but since John Marshall got the shout out in the 1825 convention, it's still on brand. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great evening, and everybody stay warm, stay well, and we'll see you next month.